Welcome to Learning with the Cleveland Orchestra. My name is Rose Breckenridge, and I'm lecturing for the Cleveland Orchestra series Music in Depth. Today we're looking at Felix Mendelssohn and his Symphonia No. 7 in D minor. I'll be talking about Mendelssohn's life and also his musical style, and I'll give you background for the Symphonia No. 7, plus a musical tour of the piece. So let's get started. Felix Mendelssohn was born in 1809 in Germany. His family was wealthy, highly educated, and loving. Felix, his name means happy, was the grandson of Moses Mendelssohn, the great 18th century Jewish philosopher. His father, Felix's father, was an art-loving banker, and his mother was loving, devoted, and well-educated. His sister Fanny, very musically talented, just like Felix, was his devoted friend and companion while they were growing up. Felix's father had his Jewish family baptize Protestant Christians when Felix was just 7 years old. But throughout his life, Mendelssohn preferred to remain quite private whenever asked about his religious beliefs. Although he practiced Christianity, he was very interested in his Jewish origins and heritage, and quite proud of it. Growing up, Felix and Fanny received a thorough and well-rounded Renaissance education. They were taught literature, philosophy, languages, and art. Plus, they studied music extensively with Berlin's finest teacher in the field, Karl Zelter, who was a friend of that great German writer Goethe. The Mendelssohn home in Berlin was a gathering place for artists and intellectuals. Their garden house was a scene of many concerts where Felix, as a teenager, often directed a small orchestra performing his very own compositions. In fact, he presented his quite famous overture to A Midsummer Night's Dream there when he was only 17 years old. As a young adult, Mendelssohn was sent by his father on a grand tour of Europe that included stays in both Scotland and Italy. Inspired by those picturesque locales, Mendelssohn composed works that included his very popular Scottish and Italian symphonies inspired by those trips. He excelled in many roles throughout his life. In 1835, when he was just 26 years old, he was appointed conductor of the Gewandhaus Orchestra, and later, in 1843, he founded the Leipzig Conservatory. He raised both institutions to exceptionally high standards. In 1836, he fell in love with Cécile Jean Renaud, who was the daughter of a French Protestant minister. They were married in 1837 and went on to have 5 children. One sadly died in childhood. Now, as a composer, Mendelssohn was also an administrator and a conductor, of course. But as a composer, his works ranged over many genres and included piano pieces, symphonies, concertos, and choral music. His very famous and beloved violin concerto, written in 1844 for his close friend Ferdinand David, is ranked as one of the most beautiful violin concertos ever written, along with those by Beethoven, Brahms, and Brooks. Beside his active musical life in Germany, Mendelssohn was very well liked throughout Europe, especially in England. His last major composition, his oratorio Elijah, won him great triumphs there when he led the premiere at Birmingham in 1846. He was exhausted from the demands of producing his oratorio Elijah, and so Mendelssohn returned home to his wife and family in Germany. But the death of his beloved sister Fanny of a stroke in May of 1847 shattered him, and just 6 months later, in November of 1847, he also died of a stroke, much too young, at the age of 38. In terms of his musical style, Mendelssohn aimed to preserve the purity of classical forms in an age, the 19th century, Romantic age that was turning away from them. He was a romantic innovator, but he was also a fastidious classical craftsman. His early works reveal him as a tender poet of nature. Just think of his Hebrides Overture or the Overture to A Midsummer Night's Dream. The Hebrides inspired by his visit to Scotland, and A Midsummer Night's Dream inspired by his readings of that play by Shakespeare. Or think of his lyric piano pieces, songs without words, with often poetic titles. Now, his mature works show a commitment to tradition, even while he continued to introduce new romantic innovations. Think of his concertos, where he omitted an opening tutti and linked some of the movements together, both innovations, or his symphonies that we mentioned with their extra musical references. His melodious solo songs reveal his lyric gift, and his oratorios, he wrote two very important ones, St. Paul and Elijah, add a dramatic flair to his style. They also exhibit a strong mastery of Baroque counterpoint. Now, Mendelssohn's music was very popular and well respected throughout Europe during his lifetime. But some of his contemporaries, most notably the iconoclastic composers Berlioz and Liszt, did not like Mendelssohn's style for what they perceived as excessive conservatism. And then after he died, the anti-Semitic composer Richard Wagner disparaged Mendelssohn's music from, we might say, questionable motives. And sadly, during the 20th century, the Nazi rule in Germany during that terrible time, Mendelssohn's music was actually banned because of his Jewish heritage. Now, what about Symphonia No. 7 in D minor? Well, as a youth, Mendelssohn learned his love of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven from his expert teacher, Karl Zelter, who introduced him to also the then neglected Baroque composer, Johann Sebastian Bach. Zelter taught Mendelssohn the master's contrapuntal techniques. And by the way, at the young age of 20, Mendelssohn, who learned from Zelter so well to love and respect Bach, actually brought about a performance of Bach's very long and forgotten masterpiece. This was the St. Matthew Passion. He brought it to performance in Berlin under the guidance of Zelter, and it was a superb success, and it actually started a revival of interest in the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. But back to his youth. Between the ages of 12 and 14, Mendelssohn astonishingly incorporated classical and Baroque techniques into his very first symphonies, which he wrote between the years of 1821 and 1823. Now later, he regarded these early, primarily string symphonies as juvenilia, and he actually suppressed them. So we didn't know about those works. In fact, they were only rediscovered in the 1960s and finally published in the early 1970s, edited by Helmuth Christian Wolff. Now, these early symphonies exhibit the mastery that the young Mendelssohn had, both of Baroque counterpoint and classical form, and also display his ability to write memorable melodies with beautiful string sonorities. In late 1821 and early 1822 is when Mendelssohn composed his Symphonia No. 7 in D minor. He was only 12 at the time, approaching his 13th birthday. The work is in 4 movements, symphonic form, and it displays what a prodigy the youthful Mendelssohn was. So let's look at the music itself and do a little bit of a musical tour. The first movement, Allegro in D minor, opens with a furious unison idea that is immediately answered by a soft lyric motif in the upper strings, creating a bit of a dialogue. Now that little lovely lyric answer is actually transformed into a true second theme in the major key that's quite slow moving and uses this very dissonant suspensions over a quite active accompaniment. So let's hear that transformation of the soft lyric answer into a true second theme. And here that active accompaniment becomes pizzicato. Now the movement goes on to have a development. It's in what we call sonata allegro form, where we meet the characters of the primary themes, and then we have the rising action of the play, and then the resolution. So quite a mastery of that classical form. The second slow movement, marked andante, actually moves over to D major. And Mendelssohn marks it with the Italian term amorevole, or lovingly. And it begins with this beautiful, lilting lyric melody in D major, sung in the violins in very sweet thirds. Now what he does is he takes that idea and varies it slightly and creates kind of a pulsing that makes great contrast here. What happens here is this variant kind of pulsing begins to move around from key to key before the stable D major version of the actual theme returns. But in the reprise in this movement, we don't forget that pulsing, and what Mendelssohn does is he brings back memories and actually adds much more harmonic movement in the idea. So here it comes returning. Moving. And you just feel the music kind of dropping down to the secure ground of the main key of the piece, D major, for a very sweet, sweet return. Now the third movement, remember this is a symphony, is entitled Minuet, and we come back to the D minor of the work. But even though it's titled a minuet, it's not really a minuet. It's more like a frenzied Beethoven scherzo, and the opening theme is just demonic in how it races around. So here is the opening of the third movement. And again, here it comes. Now, the trio that follows is much calmer, and it moves over to a major key, but we'll see that it's quite serene and sort of, if you will, throws oil on troubled waters. Here it is. It's almost like it starts out slow and then gets a little faster as the different ideas are kind of following each other, and it becomes even more imitative at this coming point. Here it is again. Normally, after the trio, the minuet would return to round out the movement, but the young composer did not mark the score for that customary return of the minuet. So we have to say, did he just forget to write it in, or did he choose not to? Well, we don't know. Let's move on to the fourth movement, Allegro molto. This is an amazing movement, especially considering the youth of the composer. He was only 12 years old. What were you doing when you were 12 years old? This fourth movement is actually a fusion of the classical sonata allegro form that we talked about, where we meet the themes, they develop in rising action and then are reprised, fusing it with the Baroque counterpoint, most importantly a fugue. So who did that before? Well, Mozart. Remember his Jupiter Symphony with its final fugue? But you have to remember also, when Mozart wrote that Jupiter Symphony, he was already in his 30s, and it was only after he got a chance to study the scores of Johann Sebastian Bach that were provided to him by his Viennese friend, Baron von Swieten. Mendelssohn stood on Mozart's shoulders, and especially had the advantage of this expert teacher of Karl Zelter, who introduced him to these. So at the beginning of the movement, we have an opening introduction in D minor, but then as the crescendo builds, out shines this, or I should say jumps, this amazing main theme, making a very forceful and energetic entrance. First the intro. Here it is. Again. The second theme is quite different. It actually is introduced in the violas in a major key, and it begins a fugal journey. Here it is. So that subject is introduced and then imitated in true Baroque fashion in the method of a fugue. But this movement actually is like Sonata Allegro. We met the two themes, our racing jubilant D major, and then our fugue subject, a little slower. In the middle section with the rising action, if you will, of the play, we have Mendelssohn choosing the fugue as the main material of that midsection development. Here's the beginning of it. Now, normally in a fugue, especially at the beginning, the other voices have respect and they allow the subject to completely state itself before they come in and chase it in imitation. But there's also a device that we call stretto, where they get impatient and they kind of jump in and pile up as in their eagerness to enter. And here Mendelssohn gives us some stretto. Now in the reprise, of course, he brings back our main idea. Here it is. But when he brings back the fugue subject, it's in a new version, treating it in sweet thirds. Remember that lyric gift that he had. Here's the return of the fugue in thirds. Eventually, however, the movement ends with a return to that exciting and jubilant opening idea. Here's the approach to that. What a tremendous work for a 12-year-old. What a remarkable prodigy Mendelssohn was. My name is Rose Breckenridge.